I was given to a human as a peace offering. My people called it diplomacy. I had been trained, from the age of 4, to call everything by its most graceful name. So I stood at the altar of the Selene Accord, and I smiled, because that is what Aelorian princesses do when they are handed to strangers in exchange for the survival of their civilization. His name was Aidan Calloway, commander, former field officer, age 41 by human count. The file my father's advisors prepared for me was 11 pages long, and I had memorized every word by the morning of the ceremony. His height, his career record, his dietary preferences, the small scar above his left eyebrow that he received during the 3rd year of the war. I knew what he had eaten for breakfast on the day his fleet pushed our eastern line back 14 systems. I knew the name of the ship he had commanded, the number of his crew, the precise wording of the surrender terms he had offered our admiral at the Battle of Vale Crossing, terms so reasonable that our admiral had wept reading them. I thought I knew him. I was wrong about almost everything. The Selene Accord was signed in the Great Hall of the neutral station known as Concord Meridian. It was a beautiful hall, if you appreciate the kind of beauty that comes from the collaboration of 17 different species working together to build something that would offend none of them. The walls were pale stone. The lighting was gentle. The chairs were uncomfortable for everyone equally. I walked down the aisle between 2 rows of the galaxy's most powerful beings, and I kept my chin level and my eyes forward. My gown was white, which in Aelorian tradition represents the end of one life and the beginning of another. I do not think the human delegation knew this. I chose not to explain it. Aidan Calloway was already standing at the front of the hall when I arrived. He was not what I had expected, and I say this, understanding that I had spent 3 months preparing to be disappointed. He was not tall by the standards of my people. He was lean in the way that working men are lean, without decoration. He wore his dress uniform correctly, every ribbon and medal in precise order, and he held himself with the kind of stillness that comes not from training, but from a body that has spent a long time being very tired and has learned to conserve everything. He had gray at his temples. His hands, when he took mine for the formal clasp of the accord ceremony, were rough. I felt the texture of old work and older decisions in his palms. He looked at me directly, which none of the other humans in the room had done since my arrival. Not rudely, not with any kind of challenge. He simply looked at me the way a person looks at something they intend to understand. I did not look away. I had been trained not to. The ceremony lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. There were speeches. There were formal readings of the Accord's 47 articles. There were symbolic gestures meaningful to 11 different cultures, and I performed each of mine correctly and with appropriate feeling. Throughout all of it, I was aware of Calloway standing beside me with that same complete stillness, listening to everything, watching the room, saying almost nothing. My first genuine surprise came at the reception afterward. Ambassador Veth of the WarHFY attended. The WarHFY are an old species, older than mine by 6,000 years. They are physically imposing in ways that most beings find difficult to ignore, and Ambassador Veth in particular was the kind of creature that rooms reorganized themselves around. Beings drifted away from him without quite knowing why. He carried with him a reputation that was not entirely made of words. I watched him work the reception, as ambassadors work receptions, moving from group to group with practiced ease. I watched the room respond to him the way rooms always respond to WarHFY, with small, involuntary adjustments. A step back here. A sudden interest in a different corner there, the kind of movement that happens below the level of conscious decision. And then I watched him move toward the corner of the room where Aidan Calloway was standing, with a glass of water, talking quietly to one of his junior aides. He stopped. Not suddenly, not with any visible alarm. He simply slowed, and then he redirected, smoothly and immediately, toward the opposite end of the room. He found a different group to join. He did not look back. His expression did not change. A being who was not watching carefully would not have noticed anything at all. I noticed. I stood with my untouched glass, and I turned this small observation over in my mind. Ambassador Veth was a creature who had once, by historical record, entered a room containing 3 armed warships and suggested they move. They had moved. He was not an individual who redirected himself for small reasons. Calloway had not even looked up. I filed it away. I said nothing to anyone. I smiled at the next dignitary who approached me, and I answered 3 questions about Aelorian cultural practices, and I thought about what I had just seen for the rest of the evening. The reception ended. The delegates returned to their quarters. Calloway and I were escorted to the suite that would serve as our shared residence, while the formal terms of the accord were finalized, a process expected to take 6 weeks. He held the door for me. An old human gesture, I had read about it. I stepped inside and stood in the center of the main room and took stock of my new circumstances. It was a good suite, comfortable, neutral in the way that places designed for diplomats are always neutral, belonging to no one and therefore offending no one. He set his jacket on the chair near the window and looked at me. "You don't have to pretend the smile is real," he said. "Not in here." I looked at him. I was not pretending. "All right," he said, without any argument or any skepticism. He simply accepted the answer and moved on. "Is there anything you need before we sleep? Anything specific to your comfort?" I told him I required only the temperature to be lowered by 4 degrees. He adjusted it without any comment about preference or inconvenience. He went to bed at what I later learned was his standard time, 11 o'clock station time, because he kept a strict schedule regardless of circumstance. I stayed awake for another 3 hours, sitting by the window, watching the station lights, thinking about a WarHFY ambassador who had walked to the edge of a corner and then quietly chosen not to go any further. I thought about the 11 pages of Aidan Calloway's file. I thought about how long I had spent memorizing details and how little any of them seemed to tell me about the thing I had actually seen tonight. I decided that night that I had spent 3 months studying the wrong material. I had read about where he had been and what he had done and how many systems his fleet had pushed through in a single year. I had not read, because no one had thought to write it, about the way that other beings responded to his presence. That, I realized, sitting in the dark with my untouched glass of Aelorian wine warming in my hand, was the thing worth studying. He was asleep in the next room. I could hear nothing, because humans sleep quietly when they are not troubled by their dreams. I did not yet know whether he had bad dreams. I did not yet know most things about him. I knew only that, in a room full of the most carefully dangerous beings in the known galaxy, one of the most dangerous of all had looked toward him and chosen a different direction. I wanted to know why. I set my glass down and opened the research terminal at the side desk and pulled up everything I could find on human behavioral studies as documented by outside species. There was more material than I expected, much more. It had been compiled by a dozen different civilizations over the course of the last 2 centuries, and almost none of it had been included in the 11 pages my father's advisors had given me. I began to read. The first entry was from a Kareth researcher, written 40 years ago, and it opened with a sentence I read 3 times before I moved on to the next one. It said, simply, that humans were the only species the Kareth had ever encountered that other predators did not instinctively assess as prey. I read until the station lights shifted from their night cycle to their morning cycle. I had barely reached the 3rd section when the door to the bedroom opened and Aidan Calloway came out in his off-duty clothes, moving toward the small kitchen with the relaxed certainty of someone who knows exactly where everything is, even in a new place, because he had checked when he arrived the night before. He made coffee. He offered me a cup. The smell was extraordinary in a way I did not yet have the vocabulary to describe, rich and dark and entirely of the earth. I accepted it. I held it in both hands and felt the warmth through the ceramic and thought that I had a very great deal more reading to do. "Did you sleep?" he asked, looking at the terminal screen, still glowing behind me. "No," I said. He nodded once, as if this answer did not require any response, and drank his coffee by the window while the station lights came up around us, and the next day of our political arrangement began. I watched him watch the stars. I thought about WarHFY ambassadors and research files and 11 pages that had told me almost nothing. I thought about the sentence that was still sitting in my mind like a small, perfectly placed stone. Other predators did not instinctively assess them as prey. I held my coffee, and I thought that if I was going to understand this man, I was going to need to ask much better questions than the ones my father's court had thought to write down. Outside the window, the station moved through its orbit, and the stars turned slowly past the glass, and somewhere in the galaxy, the peace that had cost my civilization its pride and cost my father his sleep continued to hold, because of a 47-article document and one quiet man with rough hands who had not yet, in my presence, raised his voice about anything at all. I was beginning to think that was not a coincidence. I was beginning to think that everything about him was, in some way I had not yet mapped, entirely deliberate. I finished the coffee. It was very good. I did not tell him so. But I thought about it for the rest of the morning. The days at Concord Meridian had a rhythm I had not expected. I had prepared for awkwardness, for the particular stiffness that comes from two people who did not choose each other, being forced to share space and call it something meaningful. I had prepared for long silences that felt like pressure, for polite conversations that were really negotiations in disguise. What I found instead was that Aidan Calloway had no interest in making anything feel like more than it was. He did not perform comfort. He did not fill silences with noise. He moved through the suite the way he moved through everything, with the same economy of motion, the same awareness of the room, the same quality of attention that I was beginning to realize never fully switched off. He was always listening, even when he appeared to be reading, or reviewing documents at his desk, or looking out the window at nothing in particular. He was listening to the station's sounds, to the corridor outside, to the small movements of the space around him. It was not a nervous thing, it was not anxiety. It was the practiced awareness of someone who had spent a long time in places where the first warning was often the last. I recognized it, because my father's best generals had something like it. But in them, it had always felt like effort, like something maintained through discipline. In Calloway, it felt like breathing. On the fourth morning, I asked him about the scar above his eyebrow. He touched it, briefly, the way people touch old marks they have stopped noticing. He said it was from the Battle of the Kerith Corridor, in the second year of the war, when a piece of shrapnel had come through the bridge viewport while his crew was managing a hull failure on 3 decks simultaneously. "Were you afraid?" I asked. He considered this honestly. "I was busy," he said. "Fear comes later, when you have time for it." I thought about this for the rest of the day. On the 6th day, a formal dinner was held in the Accord Suites for the senior diplomatic staff of both sides, along with several neutral party representatives. It was the first public appearance we made together as a formal couple rather than as two parties to a document, and I was aware of the room watching us for signs of whatever they expected to find. I had worn a Lorien formal dress, deep blue and silver, and Calloway had worn his dress uniform again, and we stood together at the entrance to the dining hall, and I was struck, not for the first time, by how entirely unimpressed with himself he seemed. He was not performing confidence, he simply had it, the kind that does not require an audience. Ambassador Dern of the Calder Collective was present, a careful, political creature who had built a career on reading rooms correctly. He positioned himself beside me during the first part of the evening and made several gracious comments about the Accord, and then, almost as an aside, mentioned that he had seen Commander Calloway's service record. "Remarkable career," Dern said, in a tone that was meant to be casual but was instead precise. "For a species so young." I looked at him. "For any species," I said. Dern smiled his careful smile and moved on. I looked across the room to where Calloway was speaking with one of his aides, a young woman named Lucy Farrow, who handled communications with a speed that I had found impressive even in my brief observation of her work. He was listening to whatever she was telling him with complete attention, the same quality of attention he gave to everything, and then he nodded once, and she moved away, looking satisfied with whatever the response had been. The dinner continued. The food was diplomatic food, designed to be acceptable to 7 different biologies, which meant it was mediocre for all of them. I ate without complaint, because I had been trained to, and watched the room. And then I watched what happened when the WarHFY delegation's junior representative, a young male called Geth, who had clearly been sent to the dinner as a learning experience rather than a functional one, made the mistake of placing himself too close to where Calloway was standing during the after-dinner period and began making comments, quietly but audibly, about the state of the peace terms. They were not complimentary comments. They were the kind of comments that young WarHFY males make when they are trying to establish themselves and have not yet developed the judgment to know which rooms they can afford to do it in. Calloway heard them. I know he heard them because I was watching him, and I saw the small, nearly invisible adjustment in his posture that meant he had registered the words. He did not turn around. He continued his conversation with the aide beside him for another 40 seconds. Then he excused himself politely, turned, and walked to where young Geth was standing. He spoke to him. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I watched Geth's face change, in the space of perhaps 10 seconds, from the particular expression of a young male testing boundaries to something considerably quieter. Calloway spoke perhaps 3 sentences. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. When he finished, he nodded once, pleasantly, and returned to his previous position. Geth left the dinner early. When I asked Calloway later what he had said, he was quiet for a moment, as if choosing the simplest version of the answer. I reminded him, he said, that the terms of the accord include monitoring provisions, and that monitoring works in both directions. It was not a threat, it was a fact, a simple, well-placed, perfectly calibrated fact, delivered at the right moment, to the right person, in the right tone. I thought about this for a long time after he went to sleep. I thought about how easy it would have been for me to dismiss him, at the beginning. How easy it had been, because I had looked at the wrong things. I had looked at his size relative to our warlords, at his age relative to the span of his civilization, at the 11 pages of facts that told me where he had been, without telling me anything about what happened in the rooms he entered. But I was paying attention now. I was paying attention to the fact that he made notes every morning, not of events, but of patterns. That he read widely in alien literature and history, not for strategic use, that was too small a reason, but because he was genuinely interested in how other minds had shaped the worlds they lived in. That he had 3 times in 2 weeks asked me questions about Elorian philosophy and listened to the answers with the kind of focus that told me he was not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually storing what I said. He was learning me. I realized this on the 14th day, sitting across from him at breakfast, while he asked me, carefully and without any particular agenda, about the Elorian concept of inherited memory. He was learning me the way he learned everything, quietly, completely, and without any announcement that this was what he was doing. I answered his question about inherited memory. I told him about how Elorian culture carries knowledge through bloodlines, how the memories of ancestors exist not as stories, but as something closer to instinct in their descendants, how I sometimes knew things I had never been taught. He listened without interrupting. That must make loss very complicated, he said when I finished. When someone dies, it's not just them that's gone. No one had ever said that to me. In 300 years of Elorian literature about inherited memory, in every formal philosophical treatment of the concept, no one had ever reduced it to that particular truth in those particular words. I looked at him. Yes, I said, that is exactly what it is. He nodded and finished his coffee and looked back at his documents, and I sat with what he had said for the rest of that morning and understood, for the first time, that I had married a man who was considerably more difficult to understand than his 11 pages had suggested, and considerably more worth understanding than I had thought to prepare for. The 42nd day changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty. I had not slept well the night before. There had been a long communication from my father's court, a formal one, full of careful political language that was really just a well-dressed question about whether I was gathering the intelligence I had been sent to gather. I had replied with equal formality and equal care, and had gone to bed feeling the particular weight of being in two places at once, belonging fully to neither. Calloway had noticed I was tired at breakfast, said nothing about it, and quietly arranged for my morning schedule to be shifted by an hour so I could rest. He did not ask permission to do this. He did not announce it. I found out when Lucy Farrow mentioned it while confirming the adjusted agenda, and I sat for a moment with that knowledge and did not quite know what to do with it. He had simply handled it, without fanfare, without expecting acknowledgement. That afternoon, while Calloway was in a session with the Secondary Accord Committee and I was reviewing correspondence in the main suite, it happened. I heard them in the corridor first, 3 sets of footsteps moving with the particular controlled quiet of people trying not to be heard. Then the suite door, which should have required authorization to open, opened anyway, because someone had planned this with access they should not have had. There were 3 of them, wearing the kind of neutral station worker uniforms that are designed to attract no attention. They were not station workers. The way they moved was completely wrong for station workers, and I knew immediately, with the certainty that inherited memory sometimes provides without explanation, what they were. I did not scream. I was not trained to scream. I moved back from the desk toward the interior wall and reached for the emergency communication panel beside the window, and I did not make it because the nearest one changed direction faster than I had calculated. What happened next, I have replayed in my mind many times since, and every time I find new details to be surprised by. Lucy Farrow came through the side door of the suite, the one that connected to the communications room, at a full run, holding a data pad in one hand, and she saw immediately what was happening in the room, and she did not stop, did not retreat, did not call for help. She hit the nearest intruder across the back of the head with the data pad so hard the device cracked, and she hit him again when he turned, and she was screaming at the top of her voice the whole time, not in fear, in absolute fury, the kind of sound that brings people running from 3 corridors away. Owen Burke, the station engineer assigned to our suite systems, came in from the maintenance corridor 30 seconds later with a wrench in his hand and absolutely no hesitation. He was 47 years old and had a slight limp from a knee injury he had mentioned to me once in passing. He moved like someone who had decided the injury was irrelevant to the current situation. Philip Crane, the junior diplomatic aide who was barely 24 and had spent most of the last 6 weeks looking nervous about everything, came through the main door at a run and threw himself at the intruder nearest to me, with the complete physical commitment of someone who has not yet done the calculation of whether this is a good idea. And finally, Nina Walsh, who handled the suite's food arrangements and had never, in my observation, expressed any opinion about anything more complicated than the day's menu, stepped through the kitchen door, assessed the room in 1 second, picked up the heaviest object within reach, and used it. Calloway's security team arrived 90 seconds after that. They were very fast. It did not matter, because by the time they came through the door, the 3 intruders were on the floor, and Philip Crane was bleeding from a cut above his ear, and Owen Burke was explaining to him, in a calm, steady voice, that it did not look serious, and Lucy Farrow was standing in the middle of the room with her ruined data pad still in her hand, breathing hard, looking more angry than frightened. Calloway came in behind his security team. He crossed the room in the way he crossed all rooms, with that same contained certainty, and the first thing he did was put his hand on Philip Crane's shoulder and look at the cut on his head and say, in a tone that was very quiet and very serious, that he was sorry this had happened, and that Philip had done well. Philip Crane, 24 years old and still bleeding, straightened his back and said, "It was fine, sir." Calloway checked on each of them in turn. Lucy's hands, which she had hurt on the second impact. Owen's knee, which he was not favoring, but which Calloway looked at directly and asked about. Nina, who was very calm and would not meet anyone's eyes, and to whom Calloway said nothing but simply stood close to for a moment before moving on. He looked at me last. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded. His jaw was tight in a way I had not seen before. "Good," he said. Then he turned to his security chief and began giving precise, quiet instructions, and the room became organized and purposeful around him, and I stood in the middle of it and tried to understand what I had just witnessed. They were not soldiers, not one of them. Lucy Farrow handled communications. Owen Burke fixed things that broke. Philip Crane scheduled meetings and reviewed documents, and had once apologized to me for taking the last of a particular coffee blend. Nina Walsh knew, with impressive precision, every detail of my dietary preferences and had accommodated every one without being asked twice. None of them had been ordered to do what they did. Calloway had not been in the room. There was no command, no instruction, no tactical directive. There was only a situation, and 4 ordinary people, and the thing they did, without pausing to decide whether they would. I had spent my entire life in Elorian court culture, where roles were precise and sacred, and the idea of a food manager throwing herself into a conflict above her station would have been not just unexpected, but genuinely incomprehensible. Our people protect those above them in rank because the structure requires it. They do not step outside the structure for any reason short of direct command. These 4 had no structure to reference. They had only a person they considered theirs. Later, after the medical team had come and gone, and the security review was underway, and the suite had returned to something resembling its normal shape, I found Calloway alone in the small sitting room off the main hall, reading through the incident report with a cup of water beside him and the same focused expression he brought to everything. I sat down across from him. "Philip Crane scheduled my appointments this week," I said. "He is not a combat person." "No," Calloway said. "He did not wait for orders." "No," Calloway said again. I looked at him. Why? He set the report down. He thought about this, the way he thought about things that mattered to him, with actual effort and actual time. Then he said, "Because they're my people. That's not about rank. It's not about orders. It just is." I sat with this answer. It was the most incomplete sentence I had ever heard him say, and also, somehow, the most complete. It explained nothing and everything simultaneously, in the way that the truest things sometimes do. I looked at his face. The tightness was still there. He was worried, not about himself, about Lucy Farrow's hands and Philip Crane's head and Owen Burke's knee that he had not missed even in the middle of the situation. "Will they be all right?" I asked. "Yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "Philip will think of it as an adventure in about 2 weeks, when the adrenaline memory turns. Lucy will be fine sooner. Owen has been hurt worse by things he was actually trained for." He paused. "Nina, I'm less sure about. She's private. I'll check on her tomorrow." He had already thought about all of them individually. He had already mapped their different needs. He had done this in the middle of an active security situation, as a secondary process running alongside everything else. I thought about my father's generals, who knew the names of their battalions and the tactical value of their units. I thought about Calloway, who knew that Owen Burke had a bad knee, and that Nina Walsh was private, and that Philip Crane would need 2 weeks to convert fear into a story. I sent my father's court the required report that evening. I told them the accord was secure, the situation was contained, and the diplomatic residence had passed its first serious test without damage to any principal party. What I did not write, because I was still finding the shape of it, was that I had spent my entire diplomatic education learning how civilizations protect their valuable things through structures and hierarchies and the careful arrangement of force. And I had spent the last 2 hours watching 4 people with no armor and no instruction do something that had no name in Alorian, because we had never built the concept that would require the name. It was not duty. Duty has a chain. Duty requires a structure to flow through. This was something that existed before structure, something that structure was built on top of, without most builders realizing what the foundation was. I did not have the word for it yet. But I thought about it all night, and in the morning, Calloway made coffee and checked on Nina Walsh before he checked on anyone else, and I watched him do it, and thought that I was beginning to understand something about the species I had married into that was considerably more important than anything in my 11 pages. The summit came in the 3rd month of the Accord's formal monitoring period, and I was not prepared for the Undrath. No one is ever prepared for the Undrath. This is not carelessness. It is because the Undrath are not the kind of thing that preparation fully addresses. They are older than most current civilizations, in the same way that mountains are older than most buildings. The comparison exists, but the scale defeats the mind before it can become meaningful. They had not attended a diplomatic summit involving species under 10,000 years old in recorded history. When the notification came that an Undrath delegation would be present as observers, it caused 3 days of quiet alarm among the station's senior administrative staff, followed by a general agreement not to discuss it openly because there was nothing useful to say. Calloway's response, when I told him, was to read everything available on the Undrath in a single evening and then go to sleep at his normal hour. I found this, as I was increasingly finding his responses, impossible to place in any familiar category. The summit itself was for the secondary committees of the Accord, the ones working through the detailed provisions on monitored systems and neutral zone management, things that required presence but not necessarily the principles. Calloway attended as the senior human representative. I attended as the Alorian formal observer. We sat on the same side of the table, which still produced a small internal adjustment in me every time it happened. The Undrath arrived at the 3rd session. There were 2 of them. Describing them is difficult because they exist somewhat outside the range of descriptions that work for most beings. They were large, but large does not quite say it. They were old, but old does not quite say it either. They occupied a space in the room differently from how other beings occupied space, as if the room had arranged itself around their presence in some small way that you would not notice unless you were paying close attention. I was paying close attention. The larger of the 2 took a position at the side of the room, standing, not sitting, in the way that beings sometimes stand when sitting would feel like a concession. The smaller one, though smaller is relative in this context, moved slowly along the outer edge of the room, observing the delegates the way a geologist observes a landscape, with patient interest and no particular urgency. It stopped when it reached Calloway. Not abruptly. Not with any visible alarm or recognition. It simply stopped moving and stood in a position approximately 2 meters from where Calloway sat, and it looked at him with whatever it used to look at things, and it stayed there for a long moment. Calloway did not look up from his documents for the first several seconds. Then he seemed to sense the attention the way he sensed most things, without any dramatic reaction, and he looked up and met whatever constituted the Undrath's gaze, calmly and directly, for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then the Undrath moved on. Calloway went back to his documents. I had been holding my breath. I released it quietly and returned my attention to the session's agenda, and I thought about what I had just seen for the rest of the morning. After the session ended, during the informal period before the afternoon committee reconvened, the smaller Undrath came to me. Not to anyone else in the room, to me specifically, moving with deliberate intention across the floor until it stood before me, and the room around us did not exactly go quiet, but seemed to require less of my awareness suddenly. It communicated in concepts, not language exactly, but something that arrived in the mind with the weight of meaning without the structure of words. I have done my best to put it into words since, though I know the translation is imperfect. What it gave me first was a sense of time. Not a fact about time, but time itself, age as a living quality, depth measured not in years but in accumulation. It was communicating its own perspective, the view from a point so far back in history that what I thought of as the ancient record was still relatively recent from where it stood. Then it gave me humans, not facts, not a description, but an impression, the sensation of encountering a particular kind of thing over and over in the long record of civilizations. What it conveyed was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. It was closer to the feeling of seeing a pattern you have documented before repeat itself in a new form. Every species, it gave me, breaks. Not as an insult, as an observation, accurate and without judgment. Every civilization reaches the edge of what it can survive, and some come back from that edge, and many do not, and those that do come back carry the shape of what broke them, wear it, are defined by it, are bounded by it in ways they often do not fully recognize. Every species, it said, in its way of saying things, except one. What it gave me then was harder to translate. The closest I have come, working at it for months now, is this. It showed me a thing that does not stay broken, a thing that takes the break, the loss, the edge of extinction, the moment of complete defeat, and uses it as material, not to rebuild the same shape, to build something new that could not have existed without the breaking. And the new thing is always more than what was broken. I thought about human history in that moment. I had read extensively by then, more than my father's advisors had given me, far more than the 11 pages. I thought about the plagues that had moved through their populations, the scale of suffering that should by any reasonable measure have ended them or diminished them permanently, and how instead they had come back with medicine and systems of care that had transformed their relationship with their own biology. I thought about the wars, the ones between their own nations before they reached the stars, conflicts of a brutality that I had found genuinely difficult to read about, and how each reconstruction had built something more connected than what the conflict had consumed. I thought about the century in which they had nearly destroyed their own world's atmosphere and had looked at the calculation honestly and changed, not perfectly, but genuinely, because they were, above most things, beings who could learn from the worst versions of themselves. The Undrath gave me one more thing before it moved away. It gave me the image of human gods, not metaphorically. It had records. It had watched humanity build divine figures and name them and organize civilizations around their worship, and then watched them look at those same figures with new eyes and set them aside, not in crisis, not in defeat, but in the ordinary way that a species sets aside a tool it has outgrown. And then build new ones, and set those aside too, and build again. What it said, in the way it said things, was this. Every other species that had ever built gods had done so because it needed something larger than itself to explain the universe. Humans built gods and then, eventually, looked at what they had built and found it insufficient, and built something larger. They were the only species the Undrath had ever observed that seemed to be in an ongoing conversation with the concept of divinity, as equals, forever improving the terms. It moved away. The room returned to its normal weight. I stood very still for a moment, then I walked to where Calloway was now speaking with the committee chair about scheduling for the afternoon session, and I stood beside him, and he registered my presence without interrupting the conversation, and when it concluded, he looked at me with a question in his expression. "The Undrath spoke to you," he said. "In their way," I said. He waited. "They find your species interesting," I said, which was the most inadequate summary I had ever produced, but I did not yet have the right words for the rest of it. He nodded, accepting the inadequate summary without pressing it. "They find most things interesting," he said. "That's roughly what living that long does to you, I think." I looked at him, at his rough hands and his tired eyes and the small scar above his left eyebrow, and I thought about what the Undrath had shown me, and I thought about Philip Crane throwing himself at a stranger in the suite corridor without calculation, and I thought about the WarHFY ambassador choosing a different corner of the room. I thought about the thing that breaks and comes back as something more. I thought about 4 people who did not wait for orders. I thought about a man who reads alien philosophy because he is genuinely interested in how other minds have understood the universe, and who noticed that Nina Walsh was private and needed a different kind of attention than the others. He was looking at the afternoon's agenda. He was already thinking about the next session, the next provision, the next small step in the long process of making the piece actual rather than just formal. And I thought that I had been standing at the altar 3 months ago with a practiced smile, thinking I was the sacrifice, and I was only now beginning to understand that I had completely misread the entire situation from the beginning. I had been studying the wrong things, and I had been asking the wrong question. The question was never what made them dangerous. The question was what made everything else afraid. 1 year after the Selene Accord, I am writing this document by the window of our suite on Concord Meridian, while the station lights shift toward what the systems call morning, and what I have come, reluctantly and then wholeheartedly, to accept as my favorite time of day. Calloway is asleep. He goes to sleep at his standard hour and wakes at his standard hour and keeps his schedule with the discipline of someone who understands that structure is a form of respect for everyone who depends on you. I have adopted several of his schedules. He has adopted several of mine. We have not discussed this as a process. It has simply happened, the way most of the genuine things between us have happened, without announcement. I began this document as an intelligence report. That was my father's intention, and therefore initially my own. I was to observe and document and deliver, and the document would serve the interests of the Elorian Dominion in ways that my presence in this suite was meant to enable. I stopped thinking about it that way somewhere around the 6th week. I am not precise on the date because the shift was gradual, the kind of change that does not have a beginning you can locate afterward. The day Calloway read 3 volumes of Elorian philosophy and then asked me, that evening, which of our ancient thinkers I personally found most useful now, in the present, rather than most historically significant, was one of the days I remember. Not because it was dramatic, but because no one had ever asked me that before, not a human, not an alien, not anyone in my father's court or in my years of formal education. Everyone had always asked about significance. He asked about usefulness to me, specifically, in my current life. I thought about the question for a full minute before answering, which is longer than I usually require. When I answered, I told him something I had not told anyone, because no one had created the opening for it. He listened. He asked a follow-up question. Then he returned to his documents, and I sat with the novel experience of having been asked a genuine question and having given a genuine answer, and I thought that this was either a very good diplomatic technique or something else entirely. It took me another 2 weeks to accept that it was something else entirely. The mourning season for my mother's line falls in the Elorian 7th month, which corresponds to the station's late autumn schedule. I do not speak of it normally. It is a private observance, internal, a matter of inherited memory doing what it does during the appropriate time. Calloway noticed on the first evening. He did not ask. He sat in the room with me in the same companionable silence he was capable of sustaining indefinitely, and he was simply present, and in the morning the coffee was ready before I woke, and he had cleared the day's less essential schedule items, and he did not mention any of it. I thought about this, the morning after, while watching him review his correspondence, and I thought that there are people who are kind because they have been taught to be, and there are people who are kind because it is the most accurate expression of how they understand the world, and these are not the same thing, and they do not feel the same from the inside of receiving them. He had noticed something real, and he had responded to the real thing, not to the performed version of it, or the acceptable diplomatic version of it, but to the actual thing he had observed. I was not ready, in the 7th month, to know what to do with this. I was considerably closer to ready by the 9th month, when a faction within my own father's court, not the same faction that had sent the 3 intruders, a different faction with different political calculations, began making formal arguments that the Accord's terms had been too generous to humanity and should be renegotiated from a position of renewed strength. These arguments reached Concord Meridian through official channels because they were official arguments, presented through official processes. They landed in the summit's diplomatic record. They were not private communications. They were political positions, and political positions require response. Calloway read them. I know because he reads everything. He did not mention them to me. He did not ask me about them, about my loyalties, about what my father's court was planning, or what I knew that I had not reported. He did not treat me, in any way that I could observe, differently than he had treated me the day before. He was called before the full Accord Committee to respond to the Alorian Court's position paper. I attended as the Alorian observer, which meant I sat on the opposite side of the table from him for the first time since the second day of the summit, and I was aware of this in a way that required effort to manage. He stood and spoke for 22 minutes. I have reviewed the recording many times since. He did not speak for humanity. He did not present strategic arguments about human capability or historical record or what the cost of renewed conflict would be. He spoke about the Accord itself, about what it had already done in 11 months of operation, the monitored zones functioning, the neutral trade lanes open, the 12 smaller disputes that had been resolved through the Accord's arbitration mechanisms rather than through positioning of fleets. Then he spoke about the Alorian Dominion, specifically about its history, which he had clearly read in full, and its philosophy, which he had clearly understood in depth, and the principles of governance that its founding documents encoded, principles of measured judgment and long-term thinking that were, he argued, precisely what the Accord's continuation expressed. He argued for the Accord on Alorian terms, using Alorian values, addressing Alorian concerns. He had spent 11 months learning enough about my civilization to defend our shared agreement in a language that my civilization's representatives could not dismiss without dismissing themselves. I sat on the other side of the table and I looked at my hands. I thought about the 11 pages. I thought about what I had expected and what I had found. The committee voted to maintain the Accord's terms without renegotiation. The Alorian faction's position paper was noted and filed. The summit continued. Afterward, in the corridor, he came to walk beside me, back toward the suite, and he did not say anything about what had just happened, and neither did I for a long time. Then I said, "You read our founding documents." "A while ago," he said. "You argued for the Accord using our own principles." "They're good principles," he said. "They deserve to be used." I looked at him. "You did that for me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, without any particular drama, he said, "The Accord matters, and you matter. I don't think those are separate things." I did not have a response prepared. This is unusual for me. We walked the rest of the way back to the suite in silence, and he made coffee, and I sat at the window and thought about everything I had started this document intending to write, and everything I was now writing instead. Here is what I know, 1 year after the altar. The universe is afraid of humanity, not because they are the largest. The Undrath are larger, by every measure, and they are not feared. They are revered, which is a different thing, not because they are the most ancient. They are extraordinarily young, in galactic terms, barely stepping into the long history that older species have been navigating for millennia. Not because they are the most capable of violence. Every species has violence. Violence is not unusual. The universe is afraid of them because of what they do with the terrible things that happen to them. They do not stay where the terrible things put them. They take the worst that existence can produce, and they look at it honestly, and they grieve it genuinely, and then they build something from it that could not have existed without it. And whatever they build is always more connected, more capable, more reaching than what came before. They are the only species the Undrath have ever observed that appears to be improving its fundamental nature rather than simply extending it. This is, if you think about it long enough, deeply alarming to anything that intends to be permanent. And here is what I know about Aidan Calloway specifically, which is a smaller and more important truth. He is not typical. I have interacted enough with other humans now to know this, because the qualities I see in him are human qualities, real and widely distributed in the species, but not every human has learned to carry them as well as he has. He is what his species is, brought to a particular refinement by the particular experiences of his particular life. He is patient in the way that people are patient when they have learned that time, properly used, is a tool. He remembers everything, not to use it as leverage, but because information about the world, and especially about the people in the world, seems to him worth the respect of being held carefully. He is loyal in a way that extends outward to include the people around him before it circles back to himself, which is why Philip Crane and Lucy Farrow and Owen Burke and Nina Walsh acted as they acted, because loyalty that genuine produces loyalty that genuine in the people it touches. He noticed my mourning season. He argued for my civilization's values in front of my civilization's representatives. He asked me which philosopher I personally found most useful in my current life, not most historically significant, and he meant the distinction. He has been learning me this entire year, quietly, completely, in the way he learns everything, and without a single announcement that this was what he was doing. I was brought to this marriage as a diplomatic instrument. I understood my function and I accepted it, because I had been trained to accept the functions assigned to me, and because the alternative was worse for everyone I cared about. He has never, in 1 year, treated me as a function. I do not have an Aylorian word for what this year has been. I have checked, carefully and extensively, and the closest concepts in my language are all built on the idea of exchange, of two parties in a defined relationship with understood terms. What I have been living does not have understood terms. The terms have been continually renegotiated by reality, and by him, without formal process, simply by being what they have been. I said at the beginning that I had been trained to smile at everything. This is true. I was trained to perform the appropriate response to any situation, to be the graceful and composed version of whatever the moment required. Calloway has never asked me to perform anything. This is, I realize now, an extraordinary quality that I did not know enough to recognize as extraordinary when I first encountered it. I am not performing now. This document, which began as a report for my father's court, has become something I will not be sending to my father's court. I made this decision quietly and without drama somewhere around the middle of writing this final section, and I find I am comfortable with it in a way that tells me the decision was correct. The universe fears what it does not know how to hold. Humanity is uncontainable, not because it is violent, but because it is alive in a particular way, always in motion, always becoming something it was not yesterday, always finding the next thing to reach for, even when, especially when, the last thing broke. Aidan Calloway comes from that species and carries that quality in his particular way, and he has spent a year bringing it quietly into the rooms I also occupy, and I have been changed by it, slowly and then decisively, the way that honest things change the people who stay close to them. My father's court sent me here as the graceful instrument of a peace they hoped would hold. I am still that, in the formal sense. The accord holds, the terms are functioning, the monitored zones are stable, and the neutral lanes are open, and 12 smaller disputes have been resolved. But I am not afraid of him. I said this to myself first, around the 4th month, somewhat surprised by the realization, because I had not known I was afraid until I noticed I was no longer. I am not afraid of him, and I am not afraid of what his kind can become, and I am not afraid of what I have become by staying close to one of them for a year. I think that might be the most human thing about me now. He will make coffee in approximately 4 hours. The station will shift toward morning. Philip Crane will arrive at 8 with the day's schedule, fully recovered, and, as Calloway predicted, wearing the 42nd day as a good story now. Lucy Farrow will have 3 communications items that require attention before the first session. Owen Burke will have checked the suite systems before anyone else is awake and will leave a note on the maintenance panel if anything requires adjustment. Nina Walsh will have the first meal ready at precisely the right time without being asked. They are his people, in a way I do not have full Aylorian vocabulary for, but am slowly developing the concepts to name. Over this last year, without announcing that this was what I was doing, they have become mine too. I close this document now. Not because I have run out of things to say, because I have arrived at the thing I actually needed to write, and it is written, and the rest belongs to what happens next, rather than to what has already happened. Outside the window, the stars are where they always are. The universe continues, as it does, old and enormous, and full of beings who have been watching humanity since before humanity knew it was being watched, and stepping carefully around what they see. I understand now what they see. I have been living with one of them for a year. I set down my writing instrument, and I look at the closed bedroom door, and I think that the ceremony on the day of the accord, the one where I smiled in white and held hands with a stranger and told myself this was the most elegant form of humiliation my father had ever designed, was the most incorrect reading of a situation I have ever produced. I was not the sacrifice. I was the beginning of something. I just did not have the right word for it yet. I am beginning to think the right word might be, simply and entirely, home.